So without further ado, just as there's a few extra people have joined us already, we're going to welcome Anton Raven of 1C Publishing to the stage, who is going to talk about working with independent developers and lessons learned over the years. So it should be a valuable one. I see Anton joining us now, I hope, all being well. There he is. Hey, Anton, how are you?
Good morning. Good morning. I'm doing very well.
Right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure at the moment there is a riotous applause going on at home offices all across the country and world, welcoming you to the stage. But yeah, without further ado, I'll hand over to yourself, Anton. So thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Let me just share my keynote here. Okay, so my name is Anton, and I was very, very fortunate to work with some amazing independent developers in my career and on some amazing projects like Stalker, Metro, Kingdom Come, Ancestors Legacy, Iron Fury, Witcher, and many, many others, to be very honest. And currently I do publishing and I do investment in PC and console titles. At home, in my home office, I have my shelf of fame, which I'm very, very proud of. So that's the photo of that. So I started working with independent developers back in 2005, and the term indie devs did not really exist back then. However, the independent developers very much existed. And just to give you a reference in terms of timeline, this was the device we've been using for communication back then. And yeah, well, independent developers very much existed, like GSC Game World with the famous Stalker. I guess the indie developer is an independent developer. I define this for myself as a developer that works on its own IP. And the computers were very backwards back then, obviously. So, perhaps independent developers go way back, further into the past than the early 2000s, with id Software, Valve, with Half-Life, and many, many other amazing titles that were obviously independently developed. So I guess there are the indie developers of the past and there are indie developers of the present as well. And I think that they are pretty different, and we can talk a lot about how different they are, but I would point out at two very, very key differences. And I think these differences would be, first of all, the skill set, right? The modern developers are different in terms of their skill set compared to the developers of the past. Their professional level and their vision is also different. They could be better in some cases, but in most cases that they are not as advanced as independent developers of the past, simply because they can afford being this way. They got, first of all, access to the world's best tools, something that a very, very small community had access to back in the days. Now everyone has access to this for free, and obviously it makes things a lot easier. And the second thing I would name as a really big game changer is obviously the outsourcing industry and the standardization of assets. In the modern days, you can build a very large game, a very complex game, with actually a very small team, and your indie developer can be really anything and anywhere in the world. Could be a team of 2 people in Norway, or a large team of developers in Colombia, in China, in Iran, anywhere in the world, absolutely. And the first lesson that I have learned in practice, and I would like to share with you, is that really it doesn't matter, and tiny hidden indie gems exist. I found some in the past myself, And if you are a publisher or an agency or something, you're looking for great small indie teams and small indie projects, you absolutely can find them. And if you are an indie developer yourself, but you feel that you are unable to build a large team, do not despair. You can definitely become an indie gem. As a small team, you can achieve same or better commercial results than a huge team. And this is, I think, a very simple idea, but it's not so easy to actually believe this. But I have experienced in practice, I have worked with teams, very small teams of a couple of people that have achieved very good financial results. And I have also worked with large developers consisting of a lot of industry veterans that have completely failed and were unable to succeed. Yes, having experience, having more qualified people within your team does raise your chances for success. However, you can also be successful as a small team, and both options have strengths and weaknesses. This is the first lesson I would like to share for today. And obviously, the video game distribution has changed incredibly over the last 15 years. It has also changed over the last 5 years dramatically. I think you can write books about how much it has changed and how things has to be done differently now compared to what has been done in the past. But nobody's writing those books, at least to the best of my knowledge, because I think everyone is just too busy adopting to those changes. And the way this distribution system has changed led to developers being able to publish their own titles. And some of them started to believe that they can achieve everything on their own, distribution, marketing, everything at all. And in some cases, this was true, and some independent developers were able to succeed. But I think statistically only 1% of indie games are commercially successful, meaning that they make back the money invested into development. So I guess in most cases, this is not the case. And because developers, especially the new indie developers, the less experienced developers, have unrealistic expectations of themselves to succeed. As a consequence, they also have very often unrealistic expectations of the external partners, publishers, investors, marketing agencies, PR agencies. So yeah, these expectations often do not match. And unfortunately, this leads to disappointment. This leads to bad commercial results. So the second lesson I would like to share is something that I have learned the hard way, is that while you have to stay optimistic, you have to talk to your partners about the worst case scenario. And this is tremendously difficult. This is a lot of extra work. It's definitely far easier to sweet talk your potential partners into working with you. However, I think that this is very important to work on amending the expectations and working with the expectations of your partner. This helps raising the quality of the project and ultimately helps you to achieve better commercial results. So obviously nobody wants to hear about the problems. Nobody wants to hear about difficulties and challenges. And by taking these tactics, by being very honest, by being brutally honest sometimes, by talking about the worst case scenario, by trying to mediate risks, you probably are not going to become very close friends with your business partners. However, it's just business and nothing personal. So long term, it's going to pay off, because if you want to build long-term business partnerships, successful long-term business partnerships, I recommend doing this instead of sweet talking and instead of keeping everyone's expectations unrealistically high. I have made a lot of friends in the video games industry, and unfortunately also some of the corporations that I was managing didn't end up well, didn't end up or did end up with a disappointment, mutual disappointment. And I'm afraid this was due to the fact that I was not working hard enough to amend the expectations of the other party, and I regret it. So hopefully you can learn from this. I wish someone would have told me this 15 years ago. Okay, so because a lot of indie developers are not very experienced, they tend to also not pay attention to things that matter a lot. And you will not believe how many times I was pitched projects, independent projects, that did not have a GDD at all, or did not have a properly structured, developed, thought through GDD, or the GDD would lack very vital details. Basically, in most cases, as I was investigating, this meant that the developer herself or himself did not know what kind of game exactly they wanted to make. This is an incredibly typical story, especially for the less experienced indie developers. And don't get me wrong, I completely understand agile. I completely understand experimenting. However, I strongly believe that in order to be able to change a plan, you must have one first. So you can amend your plans later, but you must have a plan to amend first. And yeah, incredible mess with documentation, planning, absence of production plans, or completely unrealistic production plans, from my experience, very often lead to poor design choices, and ultimately a very poor product in the end, or a product that is performing below expectations. So this is a very important, I think, to share with you. The third lesson that I have for today is that in case you are considering a project that does not have amply developed documentation, that is lacking a GDD or is lacking production plan, professionally developed production plan, you should be very cautious. And for you indie developers, I think that it is incredibly important for you to give extra care, time, and patience to preparing your GDD, to preparing your documentation, do ample prototyping, and really answer all the questions you want answered before you start pitching your project externally to external partners, such as investors or publishers. Some developers think that external partners like co-developers and publishers are going to direct them, are going to help them. And some companies can do this. However, none of them are going to be able to help you unless you already have a very strong basis. They're not going to write your GDD for you. They can help you improve. However, you have to get to where you can get on your own first. So this is, I think, incredibly important. And again, you will not believe the amount of indie developers that are just not following this, and basically are not preparing their projects properly before they start developing them. full time. So take scrupulous attention to detail and really take your time, get ready. If you are an indie developer and you are a new developer, you do not know how to do this professionally, I think there are some guidelines online. You can learn from whoever is willing to teach you. And the more time you will spend with this, the better your final results would be. And again, if you are an investor, you're looking at an indie project, you're looking for this indie gem, just pay attention to those projects that have properly developed documentation and properly developed GDD. They are the ones that probably are going to result in better products. So these are the lessons. I hope they will help you in some way. To some of you, I guess they would seem trivial, but they were all learned the hard way by me in practice over the years. And some of them I had to learn multiple times before I really understood how it works. But obviously you are far more clever than I am, and you will be able to learn simply by looking at my slides. I would like to say that I think that indie developers, you are all incredibly talented, and I absolutely admire your braveness to enter this incredibly competitive, complicated, and tough market. And I hope that I was able to help, and I wish you all best luck. Now we can move on to questions. I'm not sure how the system works, if I have to press something.
No, well, here I am. They should be coming through on. There's a Q&A window. At the moment, we've only got one, but let's start with that one. The rest of you, audience, if you've got any questions to put forward here, you know, it's a really unique opportunity to speak to a publisher who's very experienced in that process. The first question we have actually mentions AAA titles, but considering we're talking about working with indies, I think we should, we've got a second question coming in from a certain Chris James. I've heard of him. We'll start on that first one though, which is talk about testing. Now they've asked, when is the best time to start testing when it comes to a AAA title? If obviously you're talking about the relationship between publishers and indies, so feel free to go down the indie route if you want, but from a publisher perspective, you know, I guess different publishers approach it differently, but do you have any advice on, particularly in terms of the context, what you've been talking about?
So I think that definitely the answer would depend on what this person meant by testing. If you mean testing the gameplay mechanics, or testing the prototype, or doing QA, or testing on audience, or what kind of testing, right? It also very strongly depends on what kind of product this is. Is this an online product? Is this a free-to-play product? AAA, it says, right? But is it a single-player AAA for console, or a multiplayer free-to-play AAA, right? So I think that if you mean testing, which I guess what you have meant, testing with live audience, then I would say as soon as you can, as soon as you have something playable. It doesn't have to be final in terms of quality or visuals, but you can at least test your basic mechanics on the audience pretty early on. If you want to test individual elements, you can get them tested as they become developed. So, or perhaps the intention of the question was something else, but it would have to be defined better.
Well, yeah, sure. The person that asked that question, you're welcome to elaborate in the Q&A sort of text window. I'm actually going to move down the bottom because I've just spotted Dan Glazard's question, which is really interesting. When looking to publish a game, indie developers are often debating between self-publishing or going through a publisher. Could you explain some of the, I guess, some more of the incorrect expectations indie developers have of publishers and investors? So yeah, that's really fascinating. You've already touched on it, right? I guess there's this kind of traditional perspective of the publisher, and then there's the reality of how they can be an incredibly helpful resource. And, you know, different publishers present different things. But yeah, you know, any other kind of misconceptions or incorrect assumptions by indie developers you feel are worth addressing?
Well, I think that also the question contains partially the answer to this, because there are two extremes, either going yourself or with a publisher, and these are kind of like on two different poles. These are two decisions poles apart, so to speak. So when you finally bravely decide to share your revenue with a publisher and go with a publisher, you would expect that you would be in some kind of very advantageous position suddenly. But it may have been the case 20 years ago or 15 years ago, even to some extent. However, right now, actually, everyone is competing in the same space, in the same field, under more or less same conditions. So I think that the expectation is, if you go with a publisher, they're going to enable you to be successful. And they will not be able to enable you to be successful in case something wrong with your product, or something wrong with your positioning, or something fundamentally wrong with something else. And since this is your property as an indie developer, I assume you own the indie title. You have to really be involved in every step of the publishing process as well, and help the publisher, and you have to work together. Because the only thing the publisher can really do, despite what they would tell you, what they would promise, they can raise your chances for success. Well, some publishers cannot even do that, but some publishers can raise your chances for success, but they are not going to be able to guarantee success. And I think that the expectation is, if you are sharing your revenue with the publisher, then the publisher will just make you successful suddenly by some magical means. If you do not yourself see your path to success, then the publisher is probably not going to be able to help you much anyway.
Fantastic, really interesting stuff. One of the questions that's come up, and oh yeah, I think some more have come in. I was about to say, please ask some more, dear audience, but as I spoke, another one has popped up. But first of all, yeah, there was the one, as an indie, what's the worst advice you've received? But I guess as a publisher, maybe there's a piece of advice given to indies you know.
I've also worked for indie development companies. Brilliant. Myself, so I have either worked with indie developers or for indie developers. But the worst advice, difficult question. Like I guess I just filtered it out over time. But well, I think that it used to be. And I think it's still very popular to go to physical trade shows, right? Invest in having a booth and doing press meetings, I don't know, at Gamescom, at GDC. Developers love doing this, obviously. And we've been doing a lot of this as a publisher as well, hosting our developers all over the world at events. I think that the effectiveness of this, especially for indie games, we're not talking about AAA games, talking about indie games, the effectiveness of this versus the investment you have to make is actually pretty low right now. And it's also gradually been going down. So if someone is advising, go get a booth, you will get good press meetings, I would say it's a bad advice.
Excellent, really practically helpful insight there. The next one, and I guess this kind of gets to a real classic issue of the relationship between indie, or between developer and publisher, but indie developer in this context, and kind of, you know, creative freedom and creative control. Yeah, the question, I'll read it directly. When working with publishers and investors, how much should a developer allow them to influence their project? Where is the limit, right? I guess there's expert help coming from a publisher, and then losing control. Do you have any insights on that? And I know this question could probably be subject of an hour's discussion, but
it is extremely subjective. I have a strong opinion on this. I have a strong opinion.
Good.
My opinion is that an indie developer must have a very strong vision of the title they want to create, and they shouldn't allow anyone to influence this vision. As we work with indie developers at 1C, for example, we do not ask for any changes. Once there's solid vision with the independent developer, we're not asking them to make any changes unless for legal reasons. So
Right.
sometimes, yeah, the creative freedom sometimes leads developers too far. They are breaking the law.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure, of course. You know, another bright, well, the questions are really rolling in now, which is fantastic. Let's ask the one, as a games journalist, I don't know whether I should just keep my mouth closed for this one. Does media coverage play an important part in the plans for the release of game for indies? And they've mentioned particularly, you know, indies that may not have a large contact to book themselves, like, you know, that I've been doing it 15 years and the importance and role of media has changed, certainly. But yeah, it's been fascinating to hear insights on that from the publisher perspective.
Well, I think that a lot of you have noticed how less and less effective this has become over the years, especially now. So in the past, it was of absolute paramount importance to be featured. Now, I would say social media and the point of sale, such as Steam or GOG, are far more important. If you get featured there, it's far more effective for your sales and for your brand recognition compared to media coverage. Media coverage, however, can help you early on if you have ample amount of time, 6-12 months before your first release. You can accumulate the core audience for your product, right? It helps you accumulate your core audience, and then this core audience is going to helpful at the point of sale in the social media by supporting you, by writing good reviews and stuff like this. Or maybe if you are doing a crowdfunding campaign, it's going to help you form that audience that would do crowdfunding. But when you already have a product shipping, I think the media coverage is not so important. At least, like, compared to what it was 15 years ago, you can't compare that. Like 15 years ago, it was super important. It was really a game changer. If somebody gave you a good review, a good magazine, you made it. Now it's really like, a lot of successful titles, for example, on Steam, got very poor media coverage before they become successful, and they've only started being covered once they have become successful with community. Sure.
Great. Well, at least, you know, at least some of what I do is vaguely still relevant. No, I'm being playful. We have just about got, we've just about got, yeah, a brief answer for this one. How much encouragement do indies require to promote their project properly, allocate budget and resources to media push? So, you know, I'm sure it changes from indie to indie, but you know, how proactive as a publisher do you have to be in that, pushing the indies or encouraging them in that way?
Never really had a problem with this. Never felt that indie developers have to be strongly encouraged to do this. Perhaps because since I do video game publishing, we're taking care of these costs.
Yeah.
Like if the indies would have to be taking these costs and produce cash to enable those YouTubers, produce cash to enable those advertisings and stuff like this, I guess some of them would have to be convinced. But I don't know. From my experience, I never had a problem convincing that advertising is an important factor in success.
Sure, fantastic. Right, well, on that note, with almost perfect timing, we have come to the end of our slot. So yeah, Anton, just to say thank you so much for joining us, for sharing all that information. I'm sure, you know, just tremendously practically helpful to the audience. So yeah, thank you. I'd normally say warm round of applause at this moment, and I can't get out that habit, but I'm sure it's there from our audience. And yeah, I'll let you go and hand over to our next speaker. So thank you so much, Anton.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day.